monitoring evaluation. And the purpose of the webinar series is really to feature Amplify Change grantees' work and their expertise and lessons learned on particular measurement topics that are challenging and we want to learn more. So today's speaker, we are really excited to have Katie Mayall from Center for Reproductive Rights, who will be sharing with us their lessons learned and their approaches in tracking changes in policies and laws. And my name is Pei Yao Chen. I am the Learning Monitoring Evaluation Advisor to Amplify Change, and I'm also with Global Fund for Women. Just a few housekeeping before we get started. This webinar will be recorded, and the recording will be posted on Amplify Change website probably in a few weeks. The slide, and so it will include the slides and recording. The webinar will be in English only, unfortunately, but we'll have French translation of the slides also available on the website. This is how we structure the webinar. The session will include about 30 minutes presentation, and we'll open up a Q&A. So we'll have lots of time for discussions and questions. And if you see on your screen, on the right-hand side, you have a chat box. We encourage you to ask questions through the chat box, and we'll moderate the conversation through that. As I said, this webinar is part of the kind of longer-term webinar series, and each webinar is led by an Amplify Change grantee, and each one focuses on a specific topic. And on the Amplify Change website, you can see 3 webinar series that have been conducted in the previous weeks, and you can listen to the webinar. So this is the number 4. We have more to come, so stay tuned. With that, I'm turning over to Katie to take us through the topic today.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, everybody. My name, as was mentioned, is Katie Mayall, and I'm the Director of Capacity Building at the Center for Reproductive Rights. And I'm really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about how we track progress in changing laws and policies. So just a little bit of background about the Center for Reproductive Rights. The Center for Reproductive Rights is a global legal advocacy organization that uses the power of the law to advance reproductive rights as fundamental human rights around the world. So we really focus on law and policy reform and also implementation after laws and policies are reformed. And we do this through litigation in national, regional, and international fora, advocacy, norm building before United Nations and regional human rights bodies, network building and movement strengthening, and also technical assistance and capacity building, particularly for civil society, government actors, and the judiciary. And the center works across a wide issue set, including abortion, maternal health care, contraception, adolescents' rights, and assisted reproduction. And we are headquartered in New York with offices around the globe. So we have offices in Kenya, Nepal, Colombia, and one in Switzerland where our United Nations and Europe work sits. We have worked in over 60 countries during our past 25 years since we were established. And really our operating model has evolved a lot to recognize the nuances of law and policy reform and the whole range of different inputs that really are necessary to both transform laws and policies and then make sure that those changes to law and policy are really felt on the ground, are really impactful for actually enabling individuals to exercise their rights, which I'll talk a little bit about in this webinar. So I wanted to start a little bit by just talking about defining strategies and outcomes in relation to law and policy reform and how critical this is for being able to monitor and demonstrate impact. I think one thing that I think any of us who work on law and policy reform already know is that this is never a clear-cut undertaking, and it's always really a long-term objective. It's true that once in a while we'll see policy reform or legal reform happen quite quickly, but usually it's speaking about kind of a project trajectory that we might undertake. These types of changes are often years in the making. There's often a lot of trying to change laws and policies that don't work, that are unsuccessful, that we need to learn from and think about what worked and what didn't work. And it really can be difficult to think about monitoring and evaluation in this context when you're really looking to change something that is so far in the future, or that can really be small incremental changes that lead up to something much larger. And so I wanted to speak a little bit about the importance of setting out your strategy so that you can actually identify these entry points to go in and consider whether or not different strategies or tactics were effective and whether or not they achieved their aims. So to start out, we often think about law and policy reform as the outcome itself, but actually the way that the center likes to think about it is actually taking a step back further to think about the law or policy reform as the actual output, and then thinking about how that translates into actual access to services or the ability of one to exercise their rights. So in this regard, I think this is helpful just to note in relationship to really thinking through both what you're trying to achieve with law or policy reform and why you're trying to achieve it. And I think that can help to make sure that the law or policy reform really speaks to you thinking about things like the needs of the most marginalized populations who are often excluded from access to services, thinking about what implementation will look like. And I'll talk a little bit about implementation a bit later, because I think for many of us working in this space, many of us know that transforming a law or policy can actually also sometimes be just the first step. That from there, we actually have to work closely with government officials and make sure we're holding them accountable for things like resource allocations and actually full implementation of that law and policy, or in some cases that they're not obstructing the implementation of that law or policy. So having those things in mind and those challenges in mind as you're working to transform law or policy can then make the next step much easier, both as you transition into implementation, but it also allows you to evaluate the effectiveness of what you've undertaken. I think for law and policy reform, particularly for law reform, where there's elected officials that need to vote on a change in law, or also policy reform where there's a lot of political pressure around the issues that we work on, we often have to, for better or for worse, we sometimes have to take on compromises. And for us, really having a sense of how this output links with the outcome, it can help us to evaluate the impact that those compromises might have. Particularly, I'm thinking around abortion services, where we might know that a Ministry of Health is willing to issue guidelines, around access to services, but the guidelines might have a rigid interpretation of when abortion is legal or something along those lines, or might add barriers to accessing abortion care. And as advocates, we have to assess if those are compromises we can live with that will, reach a good enough outcome that we want to say yes to, or if they are just untenable. And so I think this is part of why I'm just pointing out the need to really link your output with the outcome, so that throughout any project lifecycle, you're thinking back through, how is this output going to lead to actual access to services or whatever it might be. I also wanted to just note the building blocks of law and policy reform and how they fit into a theory of change. So I've listed on the screen just some of the building blocks that the center focuses on, and this is really not an exhaustive list at all. This is just a few examples. But I think having a clear sense before undertaking a strategy or in developing a strategy on law and policy reform, having a clear sense of how these different building blocks fit together will also help your monitoring and evaluation process. It will help you to make sure that, whichever outcome whichever output you are looking for these different building blocks to feed into, that you are then designing that aspect of the project to speak to that. And so just to give an example, if the idea of building an evidence base or doing a fact finding is about making sure that you're providing a human voice to a specific issue, knowing that will help you to then reflect back on, when you're done with that piece of the work, reflect back on the impact of it and say, did this fact finding, did these people's stories that we gathered and shared, were they then shared in a way that made people receptive to the stories and made people feel empathy around, for example, the impact of unsafe abortion? Whereas if you're building an evidence base in order to reach a law and policy maker who might be less, who empathy might not speak to them as directly, who might be more focused on what is the impact on their bottom line? What is the cost impact? That you're also making sure that as you develop the evidence base, that you're really speaking to that person's interest. And so just to note that, having a clear sense of these things before you undertake any of the activities that you see as feeding into law or policy reform is then critical to being able to go back and reflect on whether or not you achieved the goal that activity itself had. And then I also wanted to note the importance of identifying and reaching decision makers and having a sense of what their interests are and who the right influencers are to be reaching. And I think this is a note in particular for any organizations that haven't done a lot of law and policy work in the past, who are sort of newer to this sphere. I think one thing that I sometimes see in working on this, when working in this area, is that shift in mindset from doing work that's more of general sensitization around SRHR or more of awareness raising into law and policy reform can take a little bit of a shift in mindset. So it requires you to think less about, for example, how many people am I reaching and how many people am I getting this information out to more thinking about who are the individual decision makers who have the authority to change the law or policy, and how am I speaking to their interests, and how am I tapping into people who I know are influential for them. And I think for many organizations, as they pivot towards some of the law and policy work, this just requires a shift in mindset a little bit about how you think about the impact of any activity that you're undertaking to make sure that it really connects together with the goal that you're trying to achieve, which with law and policy reform is often, a handful of individuals agreeing to do something that you want them to do. Let's see, I've spoken a little bit about some of the points on this slide, but I think I wanted to just, reinforce that law and policy reform is pretty much always a long-term objective, and that it's really important to take advantage of some of the key milestones or activities that you see as feeding into this as really inflection points to examine whether or not they were successful, to think about lessons learned, and also to document the impact and showcase these milestones. I think as a movement, we can often be hesitant to really showcase midterm impacts because we feel like this work can be so long, and it feels like these small wins can be, they can feel small in the face of larger law policy reform that you're going after. But I think I just wanted to highlight a little bit the importance of really using these inflection points when you finish an activity to think about what worked and what didn't work, and also to showcase what worked or didn't work within the movement itself. Opening up these spaces for us to have this dialogue about how we're thinking about impact and what we've seen as working or not working is so critical for strengthening ourselves as a movement, and being able to make sure that something that's unsuccessful isn't then replicated by others, that we're really able to share this information outwards. I also wanted to note in this work the importance of being adaptable to changes in contexts, in particular in relation to the political realities that are pretty much always present when talking about sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I was thinking I was going to give just a small example of this. We recently were getting ready to launch a report on adolescents' reproductive rights. In a country where we suddenly were seeing a lot of backlash and a lot of activity by the opposition around reproductive rights issues. And so even though this was a project that was tied to a grant that we were working under, we had to sort of take a step back and say, is right now the moment for us, when we're seeing a lot of backlash on SRHR, to take on an issue as politically sensitive as adolescent sex in particular, and adolescents' ability to engage in sex without fear of repercussions. And we had to sort of just take a step back and think about, is this the right timing, or will this actually do harm to the movement? And I think that being able to have the foresight to think a little bit about if an activity might be harmful, and how you might go back to a donor or somebody that you're accountable to for that and talk them through sort of the repercussions that you're seeing, is really important for us in making sure that we as a movement are working towards our long-term objectives and not just getting caught in this cycle of delivering on grant deliverables that we might have or commitments that we might have without sort of having this place to take a step back and think about the political repercussions, and to make sure that we're really being sensitive to what can be oftentimes on some of these issues blowback for taking on sensitive issues. So just to say a note about the importance of trying to open up these lines of communications with sort of respective donors and being able to say to them, here's what we're planning to do, here's why we think this is not strategic at the moment, and here's our proposal of what we would like to do instead. And I think we're seeing increasingly a really strong receptivity within the donor community of being able to understand some of these challenges and really encouraging us all as organizations to feel like we can have those frank conversations. And finally, I wanted to just say a note about attribution versus contribution in the world of law and policy reform. I think going back just one slide to the list of sort of different activities that I have here about the different inputs we might have reaching towards law and policy reform, I wanted to just say a note about how we can think about the fact that law and policy reform is never achieved in a vacuum. It's always part of sort of the ecosystem of either the reproductive rights movement or often, a combination of the advocacy being done by reproductive health and rights advocates linked with a political climate that can be receptive to this and a host of other factors. And so I think thinking about and being comfortable with the fact that, no one activity or no one input is ever going to necessarily lead to law and policy reform, and being able to focus on the impact that a specific activity has, right? So if you undertake a fact finding, for example, and then you disseminate this information outwards, being comfortable with the fact that what you're actually evaluating and learning from is the impact of that individual activity, but thinking about this through the lens of how this feeds into law and policy reform, and that it's never going to be directly, I launched this fact finding and then it transformed the law or policy. I think in our dream world, that would be the way that any of this work goes. But I think as we all know, there's always a number of hurdles and challenges along the way, and it really takes us all as a community working in coalition with one another to affect that type of change. So I wanted to just provide a couple of case studies to make some of these things or some of these points that I've talked about a little bit more tangible. So I've provided here a bit of a timeline around some of the work that the Center for Reproductive Rights, along with local partners, has engaged in around abortion law reform in El Salvador. And in this small timeline, I've provided just some key activities and some key milestones from over the past 5 years, but also to contextualize that there has been advocacy around abortion law reform in El Salvador going back way farther prior to 2014. And I say this just to give the context of that this work is always really work that we're in for the long haul. And it's often filled with challenges and can seem like we're only making small strides up against sort of a mountain of work to be done, but that it's really important that we reflect on these different activities and their impact that they have and how they move us towards the type of change that we're all looking to affect. So I've focused this timeline a little bit on work that the center has been doing with partners, but this by no means is at all of the work going on around reproductive health and rights, even in just this one particular context, right? So there's so much more effort underway beyond these inputs towards abortion law reform in El Salvador. But I've provided these different activities as sort of some key inflection points for us. So I've talked a bit about publishing fact findings or documentation of reproductive rights abuses and their impact on individuals, and using those as a point of reflection around impact and thinking about if you were able to achieve what you wanted to. And the same is true for a number of the inputs on here are pieces of litigation that the center has filed, that even just filing a piece of litigation can feel like a big undertaking. And even just the point of filing is a place for reflection of thinking about, did filing the case enable you to galvanize some public support? Were you able to publicize it? Were you able to open up somewhat of a dialogue with government officials about the challenge that you're seeing that they were not previously responsive to? Has it shifted their mindset? And those are all important aspects of thinking about monitoring, evaluation, and learning, and thinking about how you went about undertaking something and the immediate impact that it had, even though it might take a few more years to see any long-term impact. And I've also provided this timeline on El Salvador a bit to show the work from 2014 to 2018. Folks will see that the last entry on here is that in 2018 we had some real discouragement where there was a potential window for law reform that closed without a bill being brought to a vote. And I think this is just to say that there's, for the reproductive rights movement doing work in El Salvador, this was, of course, a real point of frustration, and there was real hope that there might be a bill that was brought to vote, but that this can still be a space to learn from. So a space to think about, how did we not reach some of the key legislators that we needed in order for this bill to actually be voted on successfully? What could we have done to, provide them more evidence, to apply additional political pressure? And so thinking about monitoring, evaluation, and learning, not just of impact, but of also a space to learn from things that were not successful, and to think about where there were aspects of this that were within your control and aspects of it that were completely outside of your control and that you would not have been able to influence, kind of no matter what. The first part of this slide is really about some key entry points and then a key point of frustration. But I think it's important to also emphasize some of the small gains that we've seen through this time. So in the work in El Salvador, for example, we've seen the release of nearly a dozen women who were imprisoned for allegedly having illegal abortions. And so during this time, I think that those releases of individual women really speak to small changes in the ability to affect the courts in the political context, even though the long-term objective of abortion law reform is something that has, at the moment, has not been achieved. So thinking about what small strides you can make in the face of a much larger undertaking to try to mitigate the effects of a law or policy that is not, a negative law or policy or law or policy that you're trying to transform. So I've said a bit about the broad range of strategies that feed into an initiative towards law reform in an individual country. So I've noted a bit about litigation, advocacy, communications, coalition building, fact-finding, and capacity building. And I just wanted to note or reinforce that each of these should be considered separately or evaluated separately through the prism of how anybody sees them feeding into law reform. So going back to the theory of change for an individual law reform or an individual law or policy that you're trying to transform, and thinking back for how you as an advocate see these different facets or any other ones that are not listed here feeding into law or policy reform, and then making sure that you're reflecting back on that lens of what you hoped it would accomplish or what you plan for it to achieve when you do your evaluation process. So when you look at, for example, for a communications campaign, were you able to raise public awareness about the issue, but also not just raise public awareness, but then have a strategy to actually leverage that public awareness, to galvanize that public support so that people don't just know about the issue, but they're actually willing to take action. And being able to think about how you can reach that threshold of not just awareness and sensitization, but actually using that to apply political pressure. And so I think from there, I wanted to just move into another small example around milestones within an individual project and reflecting back on them. And so for this example, I have a small case study or some key entry points around work the center has done on quality maternal health care in Kenya. And similarly for this work, the goal has really been to advocate for specific laws and policies that guarantee women access to quality maternal health care in Kenya. And similarly here, I included the timeline of some key entry points around this work, in particular to show, this work for the Center for Reproductive Rights. This is a body of work we've been working on since 2008. So that goes back at least the past 10 years or more. And just to emphasize that none of this work is done quickly and none of it is done in a vacuum. And so I kind of created this timeline to show a bit of some building blocks and how they built upon one another to increase political pressure around access to quality maternal health care and changes in laws and policies. So the first activity that I have is a fact-finding that the center and some partners undertook around abuses in maternity wards, including the detention and mistreatment of pregnant women. And so that fact-finding really documented these abuses. And as a result, we were able to use that to lobby some influential government officials around taking this issue more seriously and working with local partners in this regard. And so 4 years later, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights issued a public inquiry on sexual and reproductive health. And this public inquiry largely focused on the abuse and mistreatment of pregnant women, including the detention of pregnant women who were unable to pay their medical bills. And we really understood that the initial fact finding that was issued on this was really a catalyst for sparking this inquiry. And from there, the center successfully litigated 2 cases, one around the detention of women unable to pay their medical bills, and the next one around mistreatment and abuse of pregnant women, centered upon the mistreatment and abuse of a specific woman who was, where there was a videotape of it. And eventually we succeeded in getting really strong judgments in both of these cases. But of course, getting a judgment or having law or policy reform is often actually just one step in a larger trajectory of actually making sure that the practice on the ground changes. So even from there, it's a pivot to looking at the implementation of these decisions. So looking at decisions we have around healthcare facilities, improving their quality of care, or ending the practice of detention of poor women, or mandating that the government fulfill its obligations to actually provide financial support for women who are seeking maternal health care and to actually cover the costs of that. There really is always this next step from legal gains, making sure that you're working on implementation of those gains on the ground. So making sure that you're translating those to actual measures that enable women and girls to exercise their rights or to access reproductive health services or whatever your ultimate outcome might be. And having that in mind from the beginning will help make that pivot towards implementation just a bit easier. And so that will, if you're able to do things like coalition building in the lead up to some of these things, like the law or policy reform, if you're able to build those relationships and really have a strong movement behind you, it makes it easier to make sure that you're continuing to apply this political pressure and that you're able to hold the government accountable for their obligations moving forward, and to make clear that their obligations don't stop with just the law or policy reform, but that then they actually need to make sure that individuals can exercise their rights. And so I think with that, those are just a few points that I wanted to make around monitoring, evaluation, and learning, or just some general takeaways that I have from my work at the Center for Reproductive Rights that I thought might be helpful for folks who are embarking upon this work. So I think we were now going to open the floor up for questions. And see if I can clarify anything or add some additional context for issues that might be most relevant for folks here on the line.
Thank you so much, Katie. This is really great. So just a reminder to everybody, this webinar is recorded and the recording session will be posted on Amplify Change website. The slides will also be translated to French and will be available as well. So let's, if you have questions, please type them in the chat box. We want to avoid connecting issues, so we're not going to open up for verbal questions, but please type in your questions to in the chat box. So our first question came from Nando. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. Should advocacy start before the networking in building? In identifying the building blocks for the change? Or do you build network before undertaking advocacy activities?
That's a great question. I think it can depend on the individual context and sort of how any organization is situated within the context that they're working. So just to provide some to clarify sort of the response of it. I think in an ideal world, as the reproductive rights, as a movement, we would all be as interconnected with one another as we possibly can. But of course, there's the political reality of that. But I think in relation to the networking, I think an important part of the networking is thinking about who the right actors are, who need to be at the table to affect the law and policy reform, and to what extent those actors need to feed into an advocacy plan or an advocacy strategy before it gets underway. So if you, for example, are working on an issue that's a bit either that's newer for your organization or that has not yet been really addressed within the context that you're working, it might be really important to build up those networks in advance of really creating a comprehensive advocacy strategy to make sure your advocacy strategy itself is covering all of the bases that it needs to cover. So just thinking about how the network itself or a network of allies can help to better inform advocacy strategies and bring different perspectives to the table can be really important in thinking about how you go about doing this work. At the same time, I think there's often issues that we work on where we sort of know the trajectory of where we need to go and what the kind of roadmap for getting there looks like, where the advocacy can get underway while we're building up some of these relationships. So while we're thinking about who else we might be able to bring to the table, what non-traditional actors we might want to think about working with, who might be able to expand the base of support or apply other types of pressure or political pressure around the issue. And then thinking about how we build up that engagement while starting to implement on the advocacy itself. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Katie. I'm going to go with the next question, also raised by Nando. I think this is in reference to your point about the changing political context. The question is, being responsive to the political context may be both passive and active. Which one can be effective toward an advocacy objective?
Thank you. I think in thinking about the political context of being passive versus active, I think it totally depends on the situation itself. I think it's really important to always, of course, have your finger on the pulse, if you will, about what the political context looks like and how the bearing that might have on the objectives that you're undertaking. And then I think sometimes it is being active, being responsive to the political context can also be really important. So I think thinking about where we've seen the sort of opposition or anti-choice groups mobilize, that actively countering that and not just sitting back and letting it happen can also be really important for, making clear that we as a movement believe in the health and rights of individuals, that we're willing to stand up for that. At the same time, sometimes it is better to just let anti-choice groups or negative political context kind of die down, or just let things quiet down a little bit before taking any measures around advocacy. So I think it's really a calculation that's different for any individual context, and is also something that's important for I think folks, for me, this question also feeds into the importance of networks and the importance of communication within the movement. So that as different actors working on sort of different facets of law and policy reform in any context, that we can, bring all of our brain power to the table and think about what might be the most strategic in that given context, given how different entities or actors are responding to a negative political climate.
Thank you. Our next question came from Liz from Amplify Change. Thank you so much for raising the point about attribution versus contribution. Do you have any thoughts about how Amplify Change, and I will also say other donors, can better ask and support grantees about this kind of attribution versus contribution, and how that can be better measured?
That's a great question. Let's see. So I think it's important. One thing I think that donors can do for grantees that's helpful in this regard is making clear sort of what the expectation is, and making clear that there's an understanding within, because I think for nearly all donors' approach around this, right, is sophisticated enough to understand that that the expectation is not that that an organization will do one specific thing and that is going to change the law or policy reform or the law and policy situation. So I think there's a role for donors in making sure that they are educating grantees about sort of the expectation and their awareness about the importance of law and policy reform being part of a larger undertaking, and not something that is immediately effectuated. That really takes a long time. And I think in relation to that, I think having movement building and partnerships as part of any theory of change, donor perspective, is really useful in making this clear, because I think that that's an area where we often see gaps within the movement, are these spaces for advocates to come together and really strategize and to have that space to do that. And I think that where those types of partnerships are being prioritized by donors, it also messages to grantees that nobody's expected to go out and do this work alone, that this work is done, that this work is stronger and it's done more effectively when we are doing it in coalition and when we're all coming together. And so I guess that sort of is my inclination about how I know the question was for Amplify Change specifically, but I think for any donor about how they can make sure that they're being conscientious of this, and of the fact that there's just a political reality that we are often, as a movement, as different actors within a movement, that we're often competing for the same grants, and that's the way it is, that there's never enough resources to go around for everybody. So I think also thinking about how donors can play that role in kind of helping to mitigate the need to overclaim attribution in the grant making kind of cycle, right? So having that as part of the understanding when people are developing proposals and different applications for funding.
Thank you. Our next question came from Sanila. Thank you for the presentation. How important it is to link international documents such as ICPD to achieve national advocacy objectives?
This is a great question. So I think that part of the Center for Reproductive Rights model really focuses on linking the developments that we see in international and regional spaces, leveraging those to advance progress at the national level. And we do this sometimes through political documents such as ICPD, and sometimes we do this through the human rights framework. So looking at the treaty monitoring bodies or people's treaty or states' treaty obligations, and ensuring that we are holding states accountable for those. But I think really for us, part of that is that we believe in these political declarations and commitments and these legal commitments as real obligations on the state. But there always is a strategic calculation and just a political reality about how seriously any given government or any government actor takes these documents and takes these commitments. So I think that there's an important part of considering, is this the messaging that's going to really reach who you're trying to reach? And if it's not, what is that messaging? And how do you strike that balance between a long-term objective of wanting states and governments to be accountable for their political obligations on the global scale, with the shorter-term objective of wanting them to take a specific measure or a specific action. And finding that balancing act can be really, really difficult. But I think there is just a political reality that there's often governments who openly and outright will say that they don't find these documents to be important, they don't think they're binding, who are just sort of wholesale rejecting these international obligations that they have. And I think there's some obvious sort of calculation of, putting those back on the table for those governments might be important to do from a long-term messaging standpoint. But in the short term, there's just an awareness that will need to be complemented by different strategies that will perhaps speak to the government actor that you're trying to reach, or that they might be more responsive to.
Wonderful. Our questions are coming in. So the next one came from Agnes. How can we interest decision makers in issues we find pertinent in our communities, and kindly share some tools you use to track progress of milestones?
Yeah, so I think interesting decision makers on issues that are pertinent to individual communities. I think there's always a question of which decision makers you're trying to reach, and the level of influence on the issue that you are addressing. So I think in trying to cultivate that type of interest, it's important to think about why this issue might be of interest to the decision maker. What level of influence do they have over the issue on the ground? Are they an elected official? Do they have constituents that you can tap into to make sure they're hearing from voices that elect them and that they might be more responsive to? Do you know that they are responsible for reporting into an entity that might otherwise have control. So I'm thinking about like if their political party has this on their agenda, can you tap into that to try to say, you know, this is actually supposed to be a priority of yours? So I think there's a lot of different ways of making a community issue of interest to a decision maker. And in regards to some tools to track the progress of milestones, I'm trying to think of what we might have that we can share. I can ask our monitoring and evaluation team what they might have that we could share out afterwards, both in relation to resources that they find useful in thinking about this, and then also around some of these other questions we've gotten. I'm thinking in particular around contribution versus attribution. There's some tools that some newer tools that our monitoring and evaluation team have used for thinking about this further that we can definitely share out after the webinar.
Fantastic. A comment, I think, from Agnes. When it comes to restricted funding, it is hard to convince partners to change strategy, and this jeopardize any progress that can be made to achieve to advance advocacy milestone. Any comment on that, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. I think there's, one thing that I think has been useful that Amplify Change has done in reporting back to Amplify Change is with the milestones, there's always room for commentary about, changes in plans and changes in strategy, and the ability to say, here's where we are on this milestone, but here's how the context might have changed. And I think, another kind of message for donors more generally is that having that space for those conversations around the changing context is really important for anybody who's, whose work all falls under restricted funding to be able to change course and to be able to course correct as well. And so I guess I want to compliment Amplify Change with how they have that structured, because it is a space that opens up room for dialogue about shifting political dynamics, shifting priorities, or where you see another strategy that is really effective that you're realizing that, further investing in that would actually accomplish more than taking on another activity itself.
Thank you. And I think one more person is typing. So before the questions come in, Katie, I have a question for you. I think it's so clear and kind of really that you really painted a really clear and comprehensive picture of how advocacy and kind of the pathway to create change long term. It's a long term. The time is long, and then it takes many partners, many organizations and activists, individuals to work on the change, and it requires a wide range of strategies. And I think something you said that's really stood out for me is the importance of understanding how change happens and why these individual actions contribute to the ultimate goal. So when you work with partners, could you say more about how you engage partners in thinking about that kind of sort of a theory of change, or how you think change will happen, and engage everybody in working toward the same goal? What does that look like?
Sure. So I think that looks different for any individual project that we are working on. So I'm thinking about, for given kind of the reach of the center, some of our projects are projects that are just us and one individual partner that we are collaborating with, who might be a national level partner. And where there's really, sometimes there's really alignment that we are actually fitting into that national level partner's theory of change, right? So the center's role in that relationship might be that we bring the human rights expertise, that we bring the familiarity with the international and regional mechanisms. And so then we are the ones who are actually slotting into the theory of change that the national level partner has already developed. And so we sort of are one prong of the many different activities that they might be undertaking to advance law or policy reform. And so in that regard, there really is a real conversation and understanding initially about what that role looks like and what is really effective for them at the national level. There's other partnerships that we have where we are really part of a much broader coalition. And I think in those spaces, it's undeniably true that sort of the more actors at the table, the more strength you might have as a coalition, but also the more complicated it is to really create these advocacy plans and these advocacy strategies, and to have that alignment within the movement about the different actions that need to be taken and how those get prioritized. And so I think there's in that in that context, it can be much difficult to create that alignment within a coalition about sort of what a theory of change for that situation looks like. And there's just a need for a lot more space and conversations around the different roles of different actors and who's best positioned to undertake which activities, and how to make sure that those all fit together to really reinforce one another in the most effective way possible.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question came from Emiche. Thank you for the great presentation. Could you please share an example of how you document progress and change?
Sure. So I'm just trying to think about, given the long-term trajectory of this. So we really take an approach that looks at the incremental inputs and the impacts that they have. One newer model, though, that we've been trying to, or piloting in relation with our with one aspect of our work towards law and policy reform has been in the realm of capacity building. So we've been piloting over the past few years with Amplify Change's support a newer model of evaluating actually the impacts of some of our capacity building efforts through capacity assessments. And so part of the center's theory of change is that the stronger the reproductive rights movement is, the better ability it will have to influence law and policy reform. So we have really a targeted investment around movement building and capacity building within the movement. And so one way that we were tracking this, for example, is through an actual capacity assessment, where we look at where we take kind of a baseline measurement of specific skill sets within partners. So looking at their knowledge or ability to utilize the human rights framework, their familiarity with reproductive rights issues, particularly for partners we have that work on a whole host of issues who might be newer to engaging around reproductive rights or might be more of non-traditional allies. And using these capacity assessments as both a baseline to see the areas where we can really have strong inputs on strengthening their capacity, and then also using that as an evaluation tool for us to come in after a period of time and then look at whether we're actually effective in doing so. So to move from a baseline to actually an impact assessment where we can say, was this effective in actually building their capacity? If it wasn't, let's look at the activities that we undertook towards that goal and decide why they weren't. Did we have the wrong activities? Were these activities not effective? And how would we change course, to make sure that we're achieving what we set out to undertake?
Thank you. Our next question came from Nando. Policy advocacy strategy on abortion goes along with awareness creation and destigmatization activities. Would you like to share any specific experience in measuring change in awareness in the context of policy change?
Sure. So this is a really great question. So we actually, as the center, we really fully agree that the awareness creation and the destigmatization are central parts of any advocacy strategy and of reaching decision makers, and of course of enabling individuals to actually exercise their rights, particularly in the wake of law or policy reform. The Center for Reproductive Rights does not do a lot of awareness raising or destigmatization in and of itself as an activity that we undertake. So just it's not our niche within the movement, and there's other actors within the movement that are better suited to do that work. So I actually can't share very much on measuring change in awareness itself. Although we of course are, more anecdotally, we of course are keeping track of if we file a case, what type of press are we getting around it? Is it press that actually changes people's perspective on the issue? Is it for good press versus bad press? Is it talking about abortion as a human rights issue, or is it talking about abortion in a negative context? So we're always thinking about the awareness raising and the destigmatization as sort of an ancillary part of our work. But for the Center for Reproductive Rights, the awareness raising itself and the destigmatization doesn't sit within our portfolio as sort of a standalone output that we're working towards.
Thank you, Katie. And just a reminder that our previous two webinars kind of touch on these two issues on awareness change in the context of policy advocacy. So there was one webinar session on media the kind of how the issue, the ASRHR topic is being captured in the media. The other one is about changing the attitudes and perceptions about ASRHR issues in the Muslim community. So I encourage you to check it out, the recorded session. The next question came from Ahita. Sorry for mispronouncing your name. How can you make advocacy efforts more inclusive?
Sure. I think making advocacy efforts more inclusive is really about, as advocates, who we're bringing to the table around this work. And there's, throughout, in many contexts throughout this work, there is a real lack of, there's challenges around diversity and inclusion. And it's really paramount for us as advocates that we are thinking about that from the beginning. So thinking about how we can work with other movements who are working on related issues. I'm thinking in particular around, we've been doing a lot of outreach and kind of relationship building around the disability rights community, for example, to make sure that the work that we are doing relates to and speaks to the needs, that the unique needs and the unique challenges they might face in accessing SRH services, and making sure that we're bringing that voice to the table and working to elevate those voices. And part of this, I think, is just planning and is really building, part of it's planning, part of it is really building bridges, right? So making advocacy efforts more inclusive needs to be done for the sake of making sure that those that you are including, that the unique challenges they face in accessing services are actually being addressed in the law and policy reform that you're seeking. So I think you can never approach these partnerships as sort of a one-way street where you're hoping to, partner with individuals or new organizations in order to just elevate your messaging or to bring additional voices to the table. But it really has to be about, where are their unique needs not being addressed or taken into account? What are the barriers that they are facing from their perspective? And how do we make sure that we're designing law and policy reform to really speak to some of the most marginalized or excluded populations, and that we're really addressing those challenges? So I hope that helps for around making advocacy efforts more inclusive.
Thank you, Katie. Our next question came from Jean in French. So I don't speak French. I'm going to use Google Translate. So the question is about, can you speak about innovative strategies to strengthen advocacy, to reduce stigma and increase access to quality contraception and abortion services tailored to the needs of adolescents and young people in our communities? Jean, I hope the translation is accurate.
Great. Sure. So I think one thing I would say around adolescence and advocacy strategies to address adolescents' rights, first of all, is the importance of making sure that adolescent voices are being brought to the table and making sure that there is a role for adolescents or youth-led organizations to really be at the forefront of designing these laws or policies and really speaking about what works or is not working for them, about the way that they're accessing these services, or about the barriers or challenges in accessing these services. It's been really amazing to see the investment in youth-led organizations that I think we've seen over the past 5 or 10 years, and really a shift in making sure that there's an investment by donors in making funding more accessible to these organizations and in really building up their voices. So I think there's really a lot of space for the role of adolescents to be broadened and strengthened for adolescents and young people within this type of advocacy. So the challenge that this comes with is that there is so much stigma and so much I think misconceptions around adolescence and adolescent sexuality and the need for adolescents to be able to access reproductive health services. And so I think there's also, to add to kind of the innovation in advocacy strategies around adolescents' rights, there's also a need to make sure that we are creating platforms for them to be voicing their needs and to be asserting their rights. Also as a way to counteract these misconceptions and for individuals to better understand that these are that adolescents are individuals who can act with agency, who have autonomy, and who are able to make informed decisions and need to be able to access essential reproductive health care. And so I would just kind of highlight that as an important part of innovations in advocacy for adolescents' rights.
Thank you, Katie. And I think we are approaching the end of the session. If we can open for one more question, if there are more. But Katie, you will share the tools for tracking milestones with the participants, so we can follow up on that. If there are no more questions, anything from Amplify Change team? Any questions from you? I know you have been holding your questions. Any last word from you, Katie, before we end?
Oh, just to thank everybody for coming and joining, and thank you for these great questions. And if people have follow-up questions, I'm happy to share my email address if people have questions that come up later, that they're reflecting on these issues, and that we'll definitely share out a list of tools and resources that might be helpful to folks in undertaking this work.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katie, and thank you everybody for participating and for your great questions.